Welcome to Breakthrough Podcast. Today, we're taking a deep dive into some pretty fundamental questions about justice and how the American legal system actually works. You sent us some really fascinating material for this one.
Yeah, it's a great combo.
A really thought-provoking lecture from Harvard. It's called Justice, What's the Right Thing to Do? Episode 01, The Moral Side of Murder. And then some overviews of the American legal system from the University of Virginia School of Law.
A lot to unpack there.
We're going to try to pull out the key insights from both of these sources to kind of paint a clearer picture of these complex ideas without, getting lost in the weeds.
Right from the start, what strikes me is how closely connected these two seemingly separate areas are. Moral philosophy and like the nuts and bolts of our legal system.
Yeah, absolutely.
They really feed into each other even if we don't always see it.
Exactly. And the Harvard lecture digs right into this classic thought experiment, the trolley problem. Okay, imagine this.
Okay.
A runaway trolley's barreling down the tracks, headed straight for 5 workers who don't even know it's coming.
Oh, wow.
You've got the power to flip a switch, divert the trolley onto a side track where there's only one worker.
Okay, big decision.
Most of the people in the lecture hall said they'd flip the switch.
Makes sense. Trying to save more lives, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the discussion that followed, some people even compared it to the 9/11 Pennsylvania plane crash.
Oh, wow. That's a powerful parallel.
Right. A terrible, terrible choice, but made to save even more lives. But a good chunk of the audience actually felt it was wrong to flip the switch, even going as far as comparing it to the logic behind genocide.
Whoa. That's a completely different perspective.
A really stark contrast.
It really highlights, I think, this fundamental tension in how we approach moral decisions. Like how much weight do we give to the outcome versus the nature of the action itself?
Honestly.
The 9/11 comparison is so powerful because it gets at this idea of minimizing harm in a just awful, awful situation.
Right.
But then the genocide analogy makes you confront the idea that is it ever right to intentionally cause someone's death?
Right. Right.
Even if it means saving others, is it just inherently wrong?
Yeah, those are really hard questions. And then the lecturer throws a curveball with a second trolley problem.
Okay.
This time, you're on a bridge looking down at the tracks. The only way to stop this runaway trolley and save those 5 workers is to push a large man who's standing next to you off the bridge.
Oh, my goodness.
His body would stop the trolley.
Oh, that's
And in this scenario, the majority flipped. Most people felt this was morally unacceptable.
it does feel different, doesn't it?
So different. And it makes you ask why the different reactions. The outcome is essentially the same. 1 life to save 5.
Yeah.
Initially, the audience talked about this idea of an active choice. You're physically pushing someone versus, just flipping a switch.
So what was a key difference for you in those two scenarios? It's so interesting.
It's so fascinating, right? What do you think?
I think it has something to do with the directness of our involvement, right?
Yeah.
The more involved we are in causing harm, the more we resist it morally. In the first scenario, the one death, it feels like a consequence of saving the others. But in the second one, you're using a person, an individual, as a means to an end.
Yeah.
And I think that really touches a nerve for us, It highlights this deep aversion we have to being the direct cause of someone's death.
Right. Even with good intentions.
Even with good intentions, yeah. It suggests that our morality isn't just about the results, it's about something more.
Absolutely. And this whole contrast really sets the stage for introducing 2 big schools of thought in moral reasoning.
Okay, lay it on me.
So first, there's consequentialism. Basically, it says that the morality of what you do depends on the consequences, right? The greatest good for the greatest number.
So it's all about the outcome.
Exactly. And then utilitarianism, that was championed by Jeremy Bentham, is like a prime example of this.
I've heard of him.
It's all about maximizing utility.
So that's like happiness over suffering, pleasure over pain. Right.
Yeah, exactly. The overall well-being, right?
Right, got it.
And then on the flip side, there's categorical moral reasoning.
Okay.
This one says morality is about inherent duties and rights, regardless of what happens as a result.
So there's some things that are just wrong no matter what.
Exactly. It's about the act itself.
I see.
And Immanuel Kant is a major figure in this camp.
Okay, I'm starting to see how these different schools of thought can really clash.
Absolutely. So it's results versus principles.
Right.
And this tension plays out in all sorts of real-world ethical dilemmas.
I bet.
Like this really disturbing real-life case the lecturer brings up, Regina v. Dudley and Stevens.
I don't know that one.
It's from 19th century Britain. These shipwrecked sailors, they were desperate, starving.
Oh, no.
and they ended up killing and eating the cabin boy to survive.
Oh, wow. That's intense.
Yeah, and their defense in court was necessity.
Necessity.
Like, better one person dies than all three of them?
Okay, I kind of see their logic,
Right.
but still.
Right. That's a tough one. So the lecturer asked the audience, was what they did morally okay? And most people said no.
It does feel wrong on a gut level, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And the discussion that followed touched on all these big issues like the sanctity of life, the cabin boy didn't consent to this at all.
Right.
And then the question came up, would it have been different if they had drawn straws beforehand?
A lottery to make it more fair.
Exactly. And that's where those abstract philosophical ideas collide with, like, real-world tragedy.
You know what's really interesting about this case? It throws a wrench into both consequentialist and categorical thinking.
It does, doesn't it?
I mean, the defense of necessity, that kind of aligns with utilitarianism.
Right. Yeah, sacrificing one to save three.
But then the fact that most people find it so morally repulsive, that highlights the categorical rule against murder.
Yeah.
Like the idea that every individual has a right to life, a fundamental right that can't just be overridden. And then you add in this whole concept of a lottery, and it brings up questions of fairness and procedure.
Right.
And the fact that the cabin boy couldn't consent, that underlines how important individual autonomy is.
Yeah.
It's such a morally complex case, it really gets you thinking.
It really stays with you.
Yeah.
And the conversation delved even deeper into consent. They were asking, even if the cabin boy had somehow agreed, under those dire circumstances, would that have made it okay?
Right. It's hard to imagine true consent in a situation like that.
Absolutely. And they even brought up the whole question of cannibalism. Is that inherently wrong?
Yeah, there's definitely a separate layer of moral revulsion there.
And they even considered, what if those sailors went on to do great things after being rescued?
Like they started charities or something.
Would that somehow justify what they had done?
So even their potential future actions could be part of the moral equation.
It's a lot to consider. And they brought up Bentham's idea of adding up everyone's welfare, including the families of the survivors.
So it becomes this massive calculation, trying to weigh all the potential good against the one life lost.
Right. It really exposes the limits of trying to apply a purely utilitarian approach, doesn't it?
It really does. I mean, how do you even begin to quantify the value of a human life?
You can't.
And can you ever really be sure about those future outcomes?
And even if those survivors did achieve amazing things, does that erase the fact that they took an innocent life without consent?
These questions really get at the heart of moral justification. Good intentions aren't always enough, are they?
No, they're not. And ultimately, the discussion highlighted several key objections to the sailors' actions.
Okay.
First, the act itself was seen as fundamentally wrong. Murder is murder.
Right.
Second, there was no fair process, like that lottery idea.
Makes sense.
And most importantly, there was absolutely no consent.
3 pretty powerful arguments against their actions.
Definitely. And this led to even bigger philosophical questions, like where do our basic rights come from?
Getting into the really fundamental stuff.
Why does agreeing to a fair procedure somehow legitimize the outcome?
That's the fascinating one.
And what gives consent its moral power?
So, as we think about building a just society, how do we even begin to answer these questions?
Yeah.
The lecture does a fantastic job of showing us that our gut reactions to moral dilemmas, they're not simple.
No, they're not.
They reflect this mix of thinking about consequences and holding on to fundamental values about right and wrong.
Yeah, and it forces us to think about where our moral beliefs come from.
Yeah.
And how we balance individual rights with the overall well-being of society.
Exactly. And these are the very same tensions that legal systems all over the world wrestle with as they try to define and deliver justice.
They really are.
So we've talked about some really difficult moral questions, making us think about how we, as individuals and as a society, figure out what's right and wrong. Now let's shift gears a bit and look at the structure of the American legal system. The system that actually tries to translate some of these moral ideas into concrete laws.
Exactly. And the University of Virginia School of Law videos give us a super helpful framework for understanding how laws are made and how they actually work in practice.
Awesome.
They explain that the U.S. has a federal system, meaning powers divided between the national government and the 50 states.
Okay, so it's not just one big centralized legal authority.
Nope. It's split. So that means you, me, everyone listening, we're subject to laws at both the federal and state levels.
Right, two sets of rules to keep track of.
And let's not forget about local
Oh
ordinances.
yeah, the joys of parking tickets.
Exactly. And those actually come from the state's authority. So it's not just one single legal entity in the U.S.
It's more like a layered cake of laws.
That's a good way to put it. And when it comes to the sources of law, there are multiple layers there, too.
Okay, so where do all these laws actually come from?
At the federal level, the top dog is the U.S. Constitution.
The big kahuna.
That's the ultimate authority, the supreme law of the land.
Got it.
Then you've got federal statutes. Those are laws passed by Congress.
Okay, so that's our elected representatives making the rules.
Right. And then there are regulations. These come from federal agencies, like the Environmental Protection Agency,
Okay.
and they operate under the authority Congress gives them.
So they get to fill in the details of the laws Congress passes.
Exactly. And finally, you've got common law.
Common law.
This one's a little different. It's law that develops over time through court decisions made by judges.
Oh, interesting. So judges aren't just applying the law, they're actually making law too.
In a way, yes. They're interpreting those statutes and the Constitution, and through their rulings, they're establishing precedents.
Okay, so future cases can be decided based on those previous rulings.
Exactly. And this whole structure, the Constitution, statutes, regulations, and common law, it exists at the state level, too.
Ah, so it's like a mirror image.
It is. You've got state constitutions, state statutes, state regulations, and state common law.
So it's a lot to keep straight.
It's a lot. But the key is understanding the hierarchy of all these different laws.
Hierarchy.
Yeah, like which ones trump the others when there's a conflict.
Okay, so like a legal pecking order.
Exactly. So the Supremacy Clause of the U.S. Constitution says that if a federal law and a state law clash, the federal law wins.
Federal law is king.
It is. And constitutions, both federal and state, they're higher than statutes.
Get?
And both constitutions and statutes outrank common law.
Got it. So it's a clear chain of command.
And the judiciary plays a crucial role, not just in creating common law through their decisions, but also in making sure all these sources of law are consistent with each other, especially with the Constitution.
That makes sense. You need someone to make sure it all works together.
And that process of review, of making sure laws align with the Constitution, that's called judicial review.
Judicial review. So it's like the courts have the power to say, hey, this law doesn't jive with the Constitution, it's got to go.
Exactly. That power is essential for maintaining the whole legal system.
Absolutely. Without that clear order, you'd have legal chaos.
Total chaos. Conflicting rules everywhere. No way to settle disputes fairly.
Yeah, that wouldn't be good.
Not at all. So the Supremacy Clause is vital for national unity.
Right. It makes sure there's a baseline of federal law across all 50 states.
And then the fact that constitutions are supreme, that safeguards our basic rights and limits the power of lawmakers.
Okay.
And the fact that common law is below statutes and constitutions, that just acknowledges that democratically enacted laws and those fundamental principles in the Constitution, those are the top priorities.
So it's a system built on checks and balances.
It is. And judicial review is like the linchpin and makes sure the system works the way it's supposed to.
Wow. So we've gone from these really intense moral dilemmas to the intricate machinery of the American legal system.
We have. And all those tough philosophical questions we were talking about, those are at play all the time in the legal world.
I can see that.
For instance, remember that tension between consequentialism and categorical thinking.
Yeah, results versus principles.
That comes up constantly in legal debates about how to balance public safety with individual freedoms.
Right, like how far can the government go to protect us from harm without infringing on our rights?
Exactly. And those profound questions from the Dudley and Stevens case about necessity, consent, and the value of life, those are core principles that underpin so many areas of law.
Yeah, like criminal law, our constitutional rights, it's all connected.
It is. And understanding the structure of our legal system, where laws come from, how they rank, it gives us a framework for analyzing how all these ethical considerations actually play out in the real world.
So those seemingly abstract moral debates can have very real consequences.
They absolutely can.
Today, we've covered a lot of ground on Breakthrough Podcast. We started with those thought-provoking trolley problems.
Yeah, those really get you thinking.
Then we dove into the tragic reality of the Dudley and Stevens case.
So much to unpack there.
And finally, we explored the foundational structure of the American legal system.
How it's built, how it works.
Exactly. We examined the tension between maximizing overall well-being and upholding those fundamental moral principles.
And we've seen how laws in the U.S. are created, how they're organized, and how they took precedence.
And the questions raised in that Harvard lecture about the nature of our rights, the fairness of our procedures, and the power of consent, those questions are just as relevant today as they were back then.
They are, and understanding those concepts, along with the hierarchy of laws in our system, that's crucial for anyone who wants to really grasp the complexities of justice and how our legal system functions.
This overview is really just a starting point, though. Hopefully, it sparks some curiosity, some aha moments, a desire to keep learning.
Definitely.
So think back to those trolley problems. But now, view them through the lens of legal concepts like intent and consequence.
Right. What would the law say about your actions in those scenarios?
And reconsider the Dudley and Stevens case. See how the legal defense of necessity clashes so starkly with the legal principle that murder is always wrong.
Such a powerful example.
And as you come across real-world legal issues, whether in the news or in your own life, remember the interplay between federal and state law. And remember that ultimate authority, the U.S. Constitution.
Absolutely. And for those who want to dive even deeper, explore the works of those great philosophers, Bentham and Kant.
They're foundational thinkers in this area.
And you can also research landmark Supreme Court cases, the ones that have shaped the division of power between the federal government and the states.
There's a wealth of information out there.
So thank you for joining us on this journey.
We hope you found it enlightening.
We encourage you to keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep engaging with these incredibly important concepts. What aspects of moral philosophy or the legal system did you find most compelling? Or maybe the most confusing? What other real-world situations could really test those boundaries between consequentialist and categorical thinking?
We'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, please share them with us.
And as you keep reflecting on these ideas, here's one final thought to ponder. In a society governed by laws, how can we ensure that our legal systems truly reflect our deepest moral values while also providing that stable, predictable framework for settling disagreements and maintaining order? That's a challenge that continues to shape our understanding of justice itself.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.